Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Symphonium Audio Helios, which if you haven't heard of it, no shame there. This is actually from a pretty small time company, but it's kind of a thing I like to see. So on this channel before, I've reviewed some other earphones that have been sort of the product of passions. Like they've been the product of people who are active in the audio community just deciding that they wanted to make their own earphone. And the Symphonium Audio Helios is kind of like that. So Symphonium Audio, and I'm not totally 100% sure about this situation, but I think this is what's going on. Symphonium Audio is a relatively small maker out of Singapore. They partnered with a company called Subtonic, and amongst that group of people, there are a number of folks that you can find pretty actively engaged in the audio community, including on like my Discord server. And this is an earphone that they've produced. So the Helios up front, this is not a cheap earphone, okay? This is going to be an $1,100 earphone, and for $1,100 you get, well, it's from what I understand, a 4 balanced armature set. There's actually, I couldn't tell any information on their website to confirm that it's a 4BA set, but Precog mentioned that it was a 4BA set, so I'm gonna take his word for it. He probably knows better than I do. But yeah, I've had this on loan from Symphonium for the past couple of weeks, been listening to it and comparing it to some other earphones that I've got. Really just trying to figure out, one, how does it sound? Does it sound, does it sound like an $1,100 earphone? But then two, just, kind of interested to see how does the community envision audio maybe differently than other audio companies. So in this review, I'm going to do my normal stuff. I will go through the build, talk about the fit, stuff like that, talk about what comes inside the box of the Helios, and then I'll spend some time talking about the sound quality. I'll do a little bit of comparisons. I gotta be honest, I don't have a lot of earphones in this price range for comparison, so for the most part, my main comparisons were against Moondrop Blessing to Dusk and the Moondrop S8. I think I'm going to focus primarily on the S8 for this review, and like all my other reviews, this is a live stream. So if you're watching now and you have any questions about the Helios or I guess anything else that we talk about today, please do leave it in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have a little bit of a back and forth conversation, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you have about this. Although, as I just kind of demonstrated, maybe I'm not the best person to answer all the questions, but I will do my best to answer all your questions about the Helios. But for now, let's just dive into the review and talk about the Symphonium Audio Helios. We'll talk about the build quality, but first, just kind of a quick overview of what comes inside the box. So, here's the box, so you can see it. Just relatively simple, straightforward, nice box. You do get the little Made in Singapore label on there, which is pretty cool, but otherwise fairly nondescript. There's a little bit of bragging over here. We've got a 4-way crossover, high resolution sound, and comfort fit. Okay, those are the claims. We'll figure out in a little bit whether or not I agree. But inside the box, you do get a couple different sets of ear tips. In fact, these right here, let's see if I can get them out of the case. It might be a little tough. But these right here are ASLA Sedna ear tips. I'll leave them in there. You believe me. These are ASLA Sedna ear tips, which is just one of the brands of ear tips that audiophiles tend to like the best. I've got a bunch of different ASLA stuff on my earphones, including on my Moondrop S8. So definitely a big fan of those ear tips, but they also included sort of an alternate set of, we'll call them Symphonium ear tips in the box. You do also get a little carry jar. This thing is, I don't know if you can tell. I'll give it a little clink test or something. This thing is made out of a metal. I'm guessing aluminum or something like that. But it is quite nicely built. And frankly, it looks pretty handsome. It's got the Symphonium Audio logo on there. See if we can get that to show up well. And it is, of course, quite durable and quite sturdy, and it does fit the IEMs. Again, I say this about a lot of the earphone cases that I get. Not quite something I would use personally, but that's just because of the way that I store my IEMs. I think this is actually, a pretty nice little case, and if you wanted to put this thing on a fancy shelf with a cigar box or something like that, it would look quite in place, not out of place. It would look in place. And then the other thing I wanted to call out here is that they actually include this little serial number card, which is kind of cool. The Prisma Audio Azul that I reviewed about, I don't know, 6 months ago or so. That was another IEM that came from the community, and they also included a little card like this. Just, I think it's a nice little touch. It makes it feel a little bit extra special because this is, after all, a very boutique earphone. They're not going to be, selling these things by the tens of thousands or anything like this. So if you buy one, you're going to have a fairly unique product. But I guess that's going to lead us into talking about the build quality here on the Helios. And I'll start by talking about this cable, which I'll be perfectly honest, I think this is a really quite nice cable. Now, it's not especially fancy or anything like that. That's just kind of, you could almost call this like a standard issue IM cable, a little bit on the premium side. Like it is quite solid. I have zero complaints about it, but also, I don't know, it might not impress you here looking at it on the table, but I promise you to handle, to deal with, it is quite nice. So one thing to call it here is that I do have it with a 4.4 millimeter balance connector. From what I can tell on their website, you can actually order this however you want. You can order it with a 4.4, a 2.5 millimeter balanced, or a standard 3.5 millimeter single-ended connector. So I got it on loan here with the 4.4, and I've used it on my 4.4 sources. If I were buying it for myself, I'd probably get it with 3.5 just because I'm not all about that balanced stuff, but I do, of course, have plenty of balanced sources, so no problem running it here. Maybe on that note, and I'll talk about this before we get into talking about the sound quality, the Helios is actually a little bit on the hard to drive side. So if you are deciding whether or not you want to get it single-ended or balanced, I would consider, if your sources on single-ended maybe don't have as much power as your sources do on balanced, maybe a pretty good reason to consider going for the balanced cable. Apart from that, you've got a relatively small, actually quite small Y-split, which I like to see, in a very functional chin slider. How is it that this is so hard to do for so many other companies? That is a great chin slider. And then another thing that I think is worth calling out up front or up top is the 2-pin connector. So these are 2-pin cables, pretty standard-ish, but couple of things are interesting about it. So one, there are no preformed ear hooks on this cable, as you can see. Let me try and get that back into place. Yeah, no preformed ear hooks, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, just because it's not that common. Most earphones that are worn, and this is pretty much only wearable over ear, are going to have ear hooks. I like it better without the ear hooks. It just looks a little bit tidier. But one thing worth calling out, because this is a 2-pin cable, it is actually possible to put the cable on backward. And it's also possible to not know that you have it on backward. And if you have it on backward, or if you have one of the cables on backward and the other one not backward, essentially what you're doing is you're screwing with the polarity. I don't know enough about electrical engineering to tell you why that's bad, but I can tell you that it sounds quite bad. So avoid that problem. I didn't have that problem. I think Precog figured that one out for me. Thank you. But the way that you can tell which way this is supposed to go is you can see the 2-pin connector has kind of like a slot on one side, and then on the other side is completely flat. Apparently, and this is a thing that I learned because of Symphonium, apparently it is standard that that slot goes on the outside of the IM, which I didn't know. So just orientate it so that the slot is on the outside and the flat side is on the inside, and you should be good as far as the polarity thing. But yeah, that was interesting. And then maybe one other thing worth talking about here while I'm on the cable, and this is going to bleed into talking about the build quality on the earpieces themselves, is that sort of in combination with the earpiece and this cable connector, this whole thing ends up being frankly quite tall. And because of that, and because the fact that these things are not preformed ear hooks, I actually had issues, and I'll give this demonstration when I do the fit in a second, but I actually had issues with this staying behind my ear very securely. Just because this thing is in my ear, this thing's kind of pointing up pretty tall past sort of the part where an earphone hook would typically hook around my ear. And then because there's no preformed ear hook holding it in place, basically I was fairly reliant on the chin cinch to actually hold it in place. But again, thankfully it is I guess, at least a functional chin cinch. So that's the cable, and that was maybe more than I should have talked about a cable, but there you go. I talked about the cable there, and we'll now talk about the earpieces, which, if you can't tell, these things are made out of some sort of metal. Again, I'm going to go ahead and guess aluminum, but not totally certain. But they do have a little bit of a decent weight to them, not super heavy or anything like that, but they feel certainly nice in the hand, and they've got this kind of a matte black finish on them. You know, generally pretty handsome, the coloration, although I really don't like the way this earphone looks. And most of it is not, it's like the coloration, the paint job, like the branding and stuff is fine on it. It's the shape of it. And it might just look like a standard triangle and might look like a lot of other earphones. My wife tells me it looks just like every other earphone. And so maybe this is just me being picky, but the way that this 2-pin connector kind of molds into the outside frame of this earphone, honestly, I think it's just pretty kind of, I don't know. I don't think it looks great. And as we're talking about that too, like also worth calling out that the earpieces on here are actually a little bit on the large side, and that will lead me into, I guess, talking about the fit. I'll do a quick fit demonstration here of the Helios. Honestly, you know, I've heard some chatter online about the fit of this from some other reviewers that have tried it out. You can see how it fits in my ear here. It honestly doesn't feel that large in my ear. The nozzle's relatively on the long side, so I get it into my ear canal fairly well without the body of the earphone interacting with my concha bowl too much, which is good. What I will say though, however, is that most of the fit really is down to my ear canal gripping the ear tip and not a lot of support from the concha bowl. So in combination with, you know, let's see if I can, I'm looking at my camera, see if I can show that. Basically right back here behind my ear and the Symphonium, it's basically just kind of like an empty void space, which means that the stability of the Symphonium in my ear is not that great. And then in combination here, you can see the 2-pin connector kind of rising above the bottom of my ear here, where typically you would have the ear hook kind of wrapped around right there. It's actually wrapping around much higher on my ear. And because of that, like it just kind of comes loose a lot. So that kind of combination makes for a fit that it's not the most secure. It's generally comfortable enough, although I guess also worth calling out now, this is, as far as I can tell, an unvented balanced armature design, which just means that as I look around this thing, there are no obvious holes, and because of that, like it can create a pretty tight seal inside your ear. It's not a thing that's new to me, and it's certainly not unique to the Helios. In fact, the Moondrop S8, also a non-vented balanced armature design, but it's just, I guess, worth calling out that from that combination of the unvented design, the lack of security, honestly, I think in terms of ergonomics here with the Symphonium Helios, I think it's just okay. Like, it's comfortable enough. The ingress egress is easy. Fit security is just not great, so it's probably like a 1.5 on my ergonomic scale out of 3. But you didn't come here to hear about ergonomics. Actually, you probably did. You probably came a little bit for ergonomics. But for the most part, I believe, you want to know about how this thing sounds. So, like I typically do, I'll just start by giving you kind of an overview of the sound signature here on the Helios. And maybe the best way to describe it up front, and hopefully you have some context here where this is useful, but this is kind of similar to some of Moondrop's higher end offerings, which is to say it's mid-range forward with a strong sub-bass boost, but also kind of lean through the lower mid-range and especially in the mid-bass. So I think it's really probably most similar to something like the Moondrop Variations, which unfortunately I don't have in hand to have compared directly, but I did spend quite a bit of time with the Variations, and this sound signature to me seems very similar to the Variations, but with some differences. So this is, again, a very mid-range focus. I would describe this as neutral with sub-bass boost. If there was sort of like a continuum of like And if you recall my review of the variations, I described it as neutral with sub-bass boost, but a little bit on the lean side. And I described the Dusk as a little bit less lean, and the Moondrop Blessing as less lean than that. So if there's like sort of this continuum of leanness in the tonality, I would say the Blessing 2 is the least lean. It's got a little bit of meat on the mid-range. The Dusk would be a little bit leaner than that. The Variations a bit leaner than that. And then I think the Symphonium is a little bit leaner still. So in overall, like, it comes across as a little bit of a thin, kind of low contrast version of a neutral, maybe even a little bit on the bright side, not so much a fatiguing treble, but treble is forward in the mix because of how relatively lean the lower mid-range and mid-bass is here. But yeah, that's the general sound signature. So let's go ahead and just start talking about what are the things that I like about the sound here on the Helios. And honestly, you know, first of all, that tonality, or being compared to Moondrop tonality, if you know my reviews in the past, I'm generally a big fan of Moondrop, so not a bad direction to go. But I think even more so than the tonality, the neutral with sub-bass boost that I appreciate, is the technical performance here on the Symphonium. If this thing is really just 4 balanced armatures, like, holy moly, what they're able to do with this set is pretty impressive. I think in terms of technical performance, again, we're talking about, you know, detail, image separation, sort of sound stage, and those characteristics of the sound. I do think this is honestly like a pretty decent step up from almost everything else in my music library. I think the Moondrop S8 that I have is probably the closest, but I do think this is a step above the Moondrop S8 in terms of those technical performances. Just really pretty phenomenal. So you get just excellent mid-range resolution. You get a strong sense of transparency in the audio with nice micro contrast and texture, even despite the fact that it is relatively low contrast tonally. You do still get lots of that micro contrast. So not so much of the macro contrast, you get more micro contrast, which again, just kind of gives you that sense of detail and texture. The treble here is, for the most part, pretty excellent. It extends very well, and that's, I think, part of what contributes to the technical performance, or the sense of technical performance, is just really nice smooth treble that extends really well. It is a little bit on the forward side again. I would describe this as verging on being a bright sounding earphone. But yeah, the treble that's there, it's not like sharp, painful treble or anything like that. It's nice, smooth, just well extended, well detailed, and it adds a nice sense of air and space to the sound. On that note, maybe worth calling out, I did initially, when I was listening to this, with the Sedna ear tips, and you might note that I said that Sedna ear tips are some of my favorites, but I'm not actually using them here on the Helios. My initial listening test with this, I was enjoying that treble extension, but it actually felt a little bit like too forward, and not, again, in a fatiguing sense, just it was a little bit like distracting in terms of my attention. It was just certain things were standing out in a way that I didn't necessarily need them to. Talking with Precog, he actually recommended switching to the Symphonium tips to change that. And it's interesting, if I graph the frequency response, I don't necessarily see that difference. But upon listening to it, I think Precog was totally right that switching to the Symphonium tips, it seems to just drop at least my perception of the upper treble by enough that you still get that really nice sense of space, but you don't have to deal with, well, I wasn't dealing with that slight distractiveness. Is that a word? I don't think that's a word, but we'll go with distractiveness that I was initially getting on the treble. So that's great. What else I like here about the Symphonium? The bass on this is actually pretty solid. So this is an all balanced armature set again, and typically an all BA set, you know, there's going to be some sacrifices in terms of the bass body and texture and stuff like that. But as far as BA bass goes, the Helios does a pretty excellent job. Now, the bass tuning is very much focused in the sub bass. So depending on the music that you're listening to, you might not actually get much of a sense of the bass here because it is pretty lean through the mid bass. But if you've got music that plays those really low frequency tones, the bass that this thing kicks out does a pretty good job of simulating a dynamic driver. You get a nice, deep, impactful hits. It gives you a satisfying amount of decay, and it gives a nice body to it. And then I guess the last note that I'll make, just because I made it here in my notes, is that the imaging on the Helios and even soundstage, which again I've kind of poo-pooed this word in the past. I think the Helios is an IEM that actually gives me a pretty noticeably above average soundstage. So for that, quite like this earphone. So those are the things I love here about the Helios. Let's talk now about a couple of things that maybe I don't love entirely. Honestly, the number one thing is frankly, okay, I said I do like the tonality, or I like the tonal direction here of the Helios, but if I'm perfectly honest, I think this thing's a little bit too much on the thin side. It just gives music this really like low contrast sound that sounds a little bit just like thin and bodiless in a lot of ways. And it doesn't play for all my music, to be honest. Like there was some music like Drab Majesty, which is, from what I can tell, pretty much just electronic music. That actually sounded like really energetic and bodyful. But then a lot of other music that has maybe more organic acoustic instruments and stuff like that came across quite thin here. And vocals I found also sounded fairly thin and bodiless here. And that's the sort of thing that, like, the tonal balance, a lot of the times, the more I listen to an earphone, the more I'll get like that mental brain burn in. And something will just start sounding natural to me, and then I'll switch to something else that sounded normal to me before, and it'll sound weird. This was a little bit pushed too much to the thinness that, to be honest, like my brain never really burned in with this. You'll recall my review of the Moondrop Variations. I think I made a point that the tonal balance of the variations, I thought it went a little bit too far with the thinness and emphasis in the sub bass. And the Symphonium, this actually, I think, takes that to the next level, which, if that's what you're looking for in the sound, I think you'll dig it. But for me, it's not my favorite aspect of the sound here. And then the other thing, I guess I already talked about this. I already talked about the bass here being really sub-bass focused. So if you were listening to, music that has mid-bass hits in it, like a kick drum or bass guitar and stuff like that, that maybe a lot of the tonal quantity or the tonal makeup of the instrument is in that mid-bass frequencies. It doesn't come through super strong here, and I'm not the biggest bass guy, so I'm not too mad at that. But it is the trade-off that you get by having this fairly significant sub-bass boost, which honestly is pretty fun. And I didn't have any issues with the sub-bass boost feeling like out of place or awkward or anything like that, like I have with some other sub-bass boosted IEMs. But the sacrifice is that the mid-bass body is just kind of lacking here. And so not only does that come across in terms of that thin note weight and tonal balance that I talked about, but it also means that certain instruments or sounds that are in those bass frequencies that aren't low enough just don't really come through very strong. And then the last point I will make, and this is a very minor point, but this was a tad on the sibilant side, not very bad with the sibilant, just to be clear. But it was a little bit more sibilant than some of the Moondrop stuff that I was comparing it to. So that is essentially my thoughts here on the Symphonium Audio Helios. But how does it compare to the closest IEM that I have in my library, which, to be honest, is still quite a bit cheaper. But here we've got the Moondrop S8. I'll move these things aside, and we'll talk about how these two earphones compare in a handful of different categories. But yeah, just to set the stage, this is also an all balanced armature set. This one has 8 balanced armatures. It's a $700 set, I believe. Again, from Moondrop, and versus the $1,100 Symphonium. So that's just setting the stage. And let's talk about how these things compare in terms of tonality. And I mentioned that this thing is kind of like Moondrop-ish, or it's kind of going the same direction of Moondrop, which obviously the S8 is a Moondrop IEM. It's kind of similar. This is maybe a little bit more on the Harmonish side, which means the bass is a little bit thicker here. You know, it is still, I think the S8 is still a little bit thin in the mid-range, but in contrast to the Helios, and this is where, you know, I mentioned when you're listening to one earphone for a long time, it can start to sound normal, and then you move to something else and it sounds different than you expected. Moving from the Helios over to the S8 made the S8 sound like a warm sounding earphone, and I've never really had that impression of the S8 before. The S8 to me has always kind of sounded just like a very forward upper mid-rangey sound with a relatively thin lower mid-range and fairly, you know, sizable sub-bass boost, but not too significant. Versus the Helios, it straight up sounded warm, which was interesting. So then in contrast here, the Helios just sounds really kind of thin. Again, just talking about the tonal balance, it's quite thin and not a lot of mid-bass content, where here on the S8, maybe the bass is not quite as well done. This is also balanced armature bass. I think this bass is maybe, when you get those hits, feels a little bit nicer here on the Helios, but for a lot of music, again, that doesn't play those sub-bass frequencies, I think the S8 is going to get you a lot more of that tonal content. So that is how I think about them in terms of tonality. I guess I haven't ranked them. I would have to rank them. I think the S8 I prefer tonally to the Helios, but how do I think about them in terms of technical performance? And both of these, I think, are quite excellent technical performers, but I do think that the Helios is a next step up. So I think, you know, again, $1,100, not a cheap IEM, and I have heard a lot of other IEMs that are $1,000 plus. I honestly think this is quite competitive with those more expensive IEMs in the technical performance. Just really excellent treble control, mid-range resolution, and then again, that sub-bass character is quite satisfying without having to worry at all about smearing up the mid-range or anything like that. So quite good. And then again, I actually get a sense of soundstage that to me sounds significantly bigger enough that it's worth mentioning. Meanwhile, the Moondrop S8, honestly, again, no slouch in the technical performance. I think the bass is a little bit more on the balanced armature-ish side, which I mentioned, and I would say throughout the tonal range, the balanced armature character here, the balanced armature timbre, is a little bit more evident here. In terms of treble, they're both honestly really good at treble, and that was one of my favorite things here about the S8, although I do think that the extension here on the Helios is a bit stronger. In terms of like mid-range resolution and stuff like that, I do get maybe a smidge better here on the Helios, but they're honestly really quite competitive. And then my final ranking category is going to be in the Eargonomics, and this one's really no contest. The S8 is one of my benchmarks for Eargonomics, one of my favorite earphones to wear. This thing just plugs into my ear easily. It fits securely and comfortably for very long periods of time. The only critique about this one is it's an unvented design, so it can build up pressure depending on how you fit it. Meanwhile, the Helios, also an unvented design. I found this one built up pressure a little bit more commonly. I'm not sure if it's due to how I fit this thing in my ear or whatever. But there is that. And then it's just honestly just not a very secure fitting IEM. So I found that this is an earphone I find myself fiddling with quite a bit when it's in my ear, whereas this is one that I can, you know, I can go out and play tennis in. For all the people that are out there playing tennis in your IEMs, don't do that, please. That sounds like a terrible idea. But I suppose you could. So yeah, I think that's going to do it for my thoughts here on the Symphonium Audio Helios, but I do have to give it a score. So out of 5 stars, and honestly, I was a little bit on the fence with this one, right? On the one hand, there's a lot that's really, really well done with the sound here, right? In terms of the technical performance. And then even though I've got quibbles with the tonal balance, I prefer this to like a really bassy sound. So I like that. The mid-range resolution, really pretty phenomenal. And then the treble quality is exemplary here. On the other hand, it is pretty surprisingly thin sounding with a lot of my music. And then honestly, I think my biggest issues that I have with the Helios are actually more about the build of it. So again, the quality of it, I think is actually quite nice, but the aesthetic of the earphone, the earpieces, and the way that it fits in my ear, sort of that combination of ergonomics and how much I just want to like love the thing, makes it a little bit harder for me to like. So I try to think about this thing not just as a really boutique earphone, but I try to really critique it as, what if this thing came from 64 Audio or some other big company? How would I rate it? And I think, if I'm being perfectly honest, I gotta rate this thing 3 stars out of 5. This is, again, a very, very good sounding earphone with technical performance that is competitive at $1,100. I would not describe this as an overpriced earphone, but it is a boutique earphone. And because of that, you know, they probably don't have access to the same sort of manufacturing and whatever other niceties that manufacturer like Sennheiser, 64 Audio might have. They can make an earphone that's a little bit more compact, a little bit better fitting in the ear and better looking. And maybe those things don't matter to you. And that totally makes sense. For a lot of people that are into audio, how the thing looks and how the thing fits in the ear is really kind of an afterthought in terms versus how the thing is to listen to. If you're just concerned about the listening experience, I think you will probably enjoy this a little bit more than I did. But me, I have a hard time separating them. And as is, the Helios, I think, is a very good sounding earphone. I think it's worth the $1,100, but I'm not quite tempted to go out and buy one for myself. So that is the Symphonium Audio Helios. Shout out to Symphonium for sending this in for review, just on loan. If you're interested in checking it out, I do have a link in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you found this review helpful, found it interesting, or you didn't hate it, please do hit the like button. It really does help me out. Subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Ding the YouTube bell. And YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and we can have a conversation like I'm about to have with the folks that are here now. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next super review. And folks that are here live, hang out while I get a sip. All right, folks. Let me catch up with live chat. And while I'm catching up with live chat, I'm kind of curious to get the temperature on the room here in terms of sound quality versus build quality, and within build quality, I'll include ergonomics and aesthetics, like form factor. All right, sound quality versus form factor. What percentage do you personally rate those in sort of your audio purchasing decisions? Is it 50-50? Is it like 30-70? Is it 100% sound? You don't care at all about the form factor? I'm really pretty interested in what other folks think. For myself, I didn't actually think about answering this question, but it's probably about 50-50 for me, if I'm honest. You know, how a thing looks and how it feels in my ears, how it feels in my hands, how it is to handle, all that stuff really contributes to how much I feel for the product. And the Moondrop S8, I think, is a good example of an earphone that makes me want to love it before I even hear it. And then I hear it and it backs it up. And that's why this earphone is one of my favorite earphones. But yeah, kind of curious to get another take from the folks out there. But yeah, let me catch up with live chat as best as possible. Mohammed Arabi, how's it going? Thanks for joining early. Here, and guessing 4 out of 5 stars. That was close, and again, I was really close to giving it 4 out of 5 stars. But I had to. Basically, it was when I put it in the context of, if this earphone came from 64 Audio, I think I would be pretty hard on them about the again, like the form factor stuff about this thing. And I just had to be honest with myself and go with 3 out of 5. So hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully it's justifiable, and hopefully I don't get pilloried for that one. Southwest Kitty, what's up? How's it going? Ymir, what's up? Hello, how you doing? Good to see a couple of names I haven't seen either in a while or new names. Adam Mobius, what's up? Guessing it's going to be 5 stars. Wow, good guess. Almost. Planet Jace, it's Monday morning. Oh no, that's bad news in Australia. I'm sorry you gotta go through that. On that note, though, I might actually have to keep this Q&A a little bit short because I am on dinner duty tonight, and I have to go grocery shopping right now, and it's almost 5 p.m. So we'll figure this one out. Let's get through the live chat. Ohm State, how's it going? Nice to see you there again. Asking me, will I do the Falcon? Ohm State, yes, I am reviewing the Dunu Falcon Pro. In fact, there's a squig on squig.link. I measured it, I want to say about a week ago. So I've had it for about a week, and I've been listening to it, and I think I'm really interested to hear how the Falcon compares to Moondrop's new Kato. The Kato is also coming in for review, but I think I'm going to wait for the Kato so that I make sure I have that context before I come in hot with the Dunu Falcon review. Because I'll say up front, like, I'm enjoying the Falcon quite a bit. But I think it's going to be worth having the context of those two, because they're not priced exactly the same, but they're close enough. They're both single dynamic driver earphones. They're both brand new models that I think they're going to set the stage for what to expect from single dynamic driver earphones in that price range for probably the next year or so. Abel Santiago saying a handsome cable. And I agree. This is a very handsome, like, it just, this is part of why I like not having ear hooks, by the way, too. It's just the way that a cable winds up and it looks extra tidy, whereas this is not a good example because the ear hooks here wind into it pretty well. A lot of the times the ear hooks, and again, this is me being petty about aesthetics, so in a positive way here for the Helios, but for some other IEMs, when you have the cable and it creates like a weird kink kind of shape in the cable when it's wound up, that actually, that bothers me. That shouldn't bother people. And it doesn't actually bother me, but I gotta look at it and I'm like, I wish it didn't do that. So maybe it does bother me. Rob Hawks, sorry about the typo. Well, you deleted your message, so I don't even know what your typo was, but glad to see you there. Bottled Water saying, I'd store my IEMs in that, LOL, nice and simple. Yeah, honestly, this is, again, if I had just like one set of IEMs or just a couple of sets, like, this is beyond a nice case for the IEMs. It is maybe a little bit loud. I don't know if that comes across, and like, because it's metal on metal, can get a little bit screechy, but that's a pretty minor complaint. Generally pretty handsome. But the thing is, for me, well, let me pull these in. I've got way too many IEMs, and for me to organize every IEM within the case that it comes in just kind of becomes a pain in the butt. So I have a bunch of these boxes, and yeah, I look a little bit Dextery, but I've got all of my IEMs in these boxes that stack quite nicely. And no, this does not look nearly as nice as this aluminum Symphonium case, but I do think it's more functional. So there is that. Kiseki saying the metallic sound of the case is satisfying. It's satisfying until it's not satisfying, until it makes a screechy sound, and then it's a little bit iffy. But it's not unique to this one. There's a bunch of other cases like that too. Audiofool, nice to see you there. Been a while. Planet J saying, yeah, if the hook isn't there, then the cable needs to be supple enough to fall behind the ear. And I think the cable here on the Helios is plenty supple enough. The biggest issue is just like this height right here. Like, that is a lot of height. And because of that, it prevents this thing from really getting a good grip behind my ear. It's going to be a new component of Eargonomics, is the height from the bottom of the earphone to the top of the 2-pin connector. Not really. That's too in the weeds. Mohammed Arabi asking, are those vents near the cable connector? And so I think you are referring to these little dimples here. I don't believe they are vents. Again, this thing fits like an unvented IM, and those just appear to be some sort of dimple in the build quality, but not actually holes. So there you go. Planet J, so would you say that while the different tips didn't change the graph, it did improve my Ergonomics? Ooh. Inventing more jargon, I see. I guess you could say that, yeah. And that's kind of goes into just my general experience with switching tips and getting potentially different sound. Some different ear tips I can measure, fairly significant differences in the frequency response. Usually, I've noticed it's almost always above like 3K hertz. I don't really notice any difference below 3K hertz. And most of the changes that I will see like between like 3 and I would say like 7K tend to be pretty well reflected in my hearing impressions. Past that, I think it's a bit hit and miss. And really it comes down to how does the thing fit inside your ear, and how close does, switching from one ear tip to another is maybe going to let it get a little bit closer to your ear. It can change, even things like how far away from the tip of the tip is the nozzle, like that sort of thing can change. And I think that all that kind of stuff can have an impact on the sound. But I guess what I'm trying to say is at that point, it becomes less about the measurement that you can produce, because it becomes more about how it actually fits your individual ear. And that might not be the same. Although I guess in this case, Precog's findings that switching to these ear tips fixed the upper treble for him also played for me. So, wow, this is audio's tough. Nandu, what's up? How you doing? Good to see you again. Always up asking, how does it compare to the MEST in technicalities? That's a pretty good question. So the Unique Melody MEST is an earphone I've heard the MEST and the MEST2 Mark II, but only for, I don't know, like an hour or so. I didn't have them here side by side to compare. I want to say they're pretty competitive. The tonality on the MEST is, I would say, more toward the warm side. Above the bass frequencies are actually probably pretty similar to the tuning here on the Helios, but the MEST's got more body in that mid bass and a little bit more body in that lower mid range. It gives it this fuller, warmer, bassier sound. So that's a big difference. But in terms of like mid-range resolution, treble quality, staging, and stuff like that, I want to say they're pretty competitive. The biggest difference would be that the MEST does have a dynamic driver for the bass, and it's got more bass, so I think it does give it maybe a stronger sense of depth, whereas the Helios, I think, gives maybe a bigger sense of space, a bigger sound stage, if you want to say. Why do I feel like I can't say the word soundstage now? I feel like I boxed myself into a corner making fun of soundstage, but sometimes it's a thing. To check, what type of music do I like? Okay, that's a big question. My first recommendation would be to check out my YouTube channel, and I have in the playlist tab a playlist of a bunch of songs that I like to use for testing. So that's probably the best way to get a sense for what kind of music I listen to. I'm really bad at genres, so like, maybe this is part of why I don't like making genre recommendations for earphones, but I think that's a little bit tangential. I'm just not that good at genre. So if you'd ask me like to summarize what music I listen to, I would kind of say a little bit of everything, but it's probably not really a little bit of everything. Lately I've been listening to a lot of the band called Men I Trust, which is like electronic with female vocals, but then like the more recent stuff's been a little bit more acoustic instruments kind of mixed in with electronic, and they're just kind of chill. A lot of music I listen to is kind of chill, which I don't know if that's a genre. But yeah, so I listen to that. I've been listening to a lot of Still Cigarettes After Sex, dream pop, dream rock, dream pop band. I don't know what you would call them. Very chill. But they have a lot of just like really nice guitar strums, and so like an earphone that plays well into the treble, and nice detail in the treble will give you this like really nice leading edge on the transients of the guitars. It's really quite satisfying and ASMR-y. Also been listening to lately, there is a new album out by the band The Marias. Quite a bit different than their first album. It's a little bit more poppy, but it's pretty good. Their original album was indie rock, I suppose. And the newer album's seems a little bit more electronic, a little bit more poppy, but still really good. Been listening to that lately. Also been listening to The Midnight, which I don't even know what you want to call them, like electronic rock or something like that. That are a little campy, but pretty fun to listen to. What else have I been listening to? Ghostly Kisses, a vocalist out of Canada. She tends to sing over the top of electronic music, but also sometimes over piano. She's got an album that it's her singing over the top of piano, and you can just like hear the key presses, not just like the notes that are coming from the piano, but you can hear like the action within the piano, the mechanical arms and stuff like that moving around. And that's a really, really nice album. So that kind of gives you a sense of what I've been listening to lately, but I really do think the playlist will probably give you a broader sense of my musical tastes, and what I happen to be listening to lately just tends to vary depending on my mood, depending on what's new and what I haven't played out, because I'm an album listener and I will typically listen to an album until I don't want to listen to it anymore. Not so much like a Spotify shuffle person. Adam Mobius asking, so is this an upgrade for Dusk fans, seeing as the variations may not be worth it if you own the Dusk already? That's an interesting question. I didn't consider that. So as you recall, Adam Mobius, you've got a good memory of this. My review of the variations, I described it as, I think it's a better version of the Dusk, but I didn't know that it was better enough that it was really worth almost double the price. The Symphonium here is kind of like that same direction, but taking the technicalities, I think, to a step above something like the variations. So if you really do like the sound of the Moondrop Dusk, and maybe you've heard the variations and you like it, but maybe you agree with me that it's not quite there in terms of a technical boost enough to warrant the upgrade, I do think this is technically better enough that I think this is absolutely worth moving up to. The only caveat that I will give is that it is, even though it's very similar in terms of its tonal direction, again, mid-range focus with relatively thin lower mid-range and sub-bass boost, this is it taken to sort of a next level. And so if you love the tonality of the Dusk, I think you're going to find this thing pretty bass light, honestly. But that's kind of true of the variations as well. The variations I found to sound less bassy than the Dusk. But then if you like the level of the variations, I think then again this is kind of another level in that direction. So if that's what sounds like what you want, I think yeah, this could be a really solid pick. And frankly, I can't think of anything else that goes that direction that I've heard that I would recommend as sort of like a technical upgrade. So in that sense, yeah, the Helios is not a bad option there. I'm gonna sip again. Planet J saying, if it hurts to wear, or like in the case of Bluetooth TWS, too fiddly to work with, it really doesn't matter how good it sounds. It has to be at a minimum functional. And I definitely agree with that. So like just to be clear too, the Helios, I don't have any pain in terms of fit. Like it fits fine. It's just not very secure. But there have been some earphones that I've worn in the past that were just like straight up uncomfortable to wear. I know Eargonomics is fairly known for being uncomfortable for a lot of folks, but I did get used to that, so that will not count that one. But the Thea Audio Monarch, I think also the Clairvoyance, they both have the same shell, which is actually too large for my ear. And I had to like shove it in there, which was uncomfortable, or just kind of leave it like hanging halfway out of my ear. That was uncomfortable to the point that as much as I did enjoy listening to them, I could not ever bring myself to buy them. Relahan's saying, although love good sound quality, if the comfort isn't up to scratch, then you can't really spend time enjoying the sound quality. Okay. So this is, I'm getting now to the responses to my question about, okay, actually, I'm going to back up a little bit. I asked people to give me their balance of sound quality versus form factor. And these are the responses I got. So Always Up is saying 15% from form factor, 85% from sound. And I think that's probably a pretty good number that I would guess encompass a lot of the audiophile community. Kiseki saying sound is 70 and form is 30, so a little bit more toward the sound, but I think again in that similar range. Adamobius also similar. You're saying 75% sound, 25% to Eargonomics for you. So here's where I'm more in the 50-50 camp. Thomas Voyden, sounds like you are also in the 50-50 camp. Carlos, it sounds like you are in the 65 sound, 35 in the form factor, which I think is a little bit closer to my balance. I could probably get on with that. I could agree to that. Let's see what other answers we got. And then John Doe, the famous John Doe. I've heard of you before. Saying it's perfectly reasonable to expect an exquisite show when you pay $1,100. Wonder what the margins are on this. To be honest, I would not expect that the margins are especially great on this earphone, just because they're probably manufacturing this thing in very small quantities. So when you're manufacturing like a KZ earphone, right? You're manufacturing a $17 KZ earphone. You can only sell that thing for $17 because you're making thousands of them. The Helios, this is, I've got the papers. This is number 38. They've only made 38 of these things. I mean, maybe they've made a little bit more than that at this point, but they're not making these things by the tens of thousands. So they're going to cost more to make. So, and again, they don't have access to some of the same manufacturing techniques and machining and stuff like that you would have at a more just a bigger audio company. So some of that I forgive them, but if you're spending $1,100, that's pretty real money. I appreciate you saying that it's reasonable to hope for a form factor that I love more. Jorge, you're going with 60-40. I think that's reasonable. The 70-30 people, I think you're slightly unreasonable. I'm just joking. I'm not going to critique your personal preferences, but 70-30 is a little bit too far for me. 60-40, I think I can go with that. I can settle on 60-40. To check saying if there are other products that sound as good, probably it comes all down to looks. If it's unique, 60 for the sound. I think that's actually a really good way to put it. Is $1,100, right? At $1,100, you've got your pick of a lot of really good sounding earphones. The Symphonium is one of them. This is a very good sounding earphone. Not quite my preferred tonal balance, but let's assume this is your preferred tonal balance and you want to spend $1,100. This is an option, but there are other options out there. Maybe none that have this exact tonal balance, but we talked about the MEST. It's a pretty good option. Yeah, I think when you're looking at you've got $1,100 burning a hole in your wallet or whatever, you've got 4 or 5 different earphones that will probably do you well in terms of sound quality, then 100% of it can come down to the form factor. I think that's a good point, good way to put it. Abo asking do I know if there's an IM below $200 with a similar sound signature to the Azul? The closest thing would probably be the Etymotic ER4 XR, which initially was not under $200, but now it's pretty regularly available for under $200. So that would probably be the closest. Otherwise, I can't think of anything, no. I mean, maybe an ER2 SE ish. Not really though. I think the ER4XR is probably the closest. Ymir, is the Moondrop Variations hard to drive? No, I found the variations to be pretty average sensitivity, about the same as like the Blessing 2 or the S8. Not the most sensitive, like it's not overly sensitive or anything like that. There are some earphones that are really sensitive, and it's not that, but I would say it's pretty average. My Life Matters saying, just got back from Can Jam. Thanks for the report. Saying, my favorite is the Empire Ears Legend Evo. Had to fight back my tears while listening to some of my favorite tracks. Wow, that's a good experience. The chick asking, how do I maintain my IEMs, the nozzle, the shells, etc., cables and ear tips? I buy, is it worth? No, it's not worth me grabbing. I just buy like these boxes of alcohol wipes for like $5. You can get a box of 200 alcohol wipes, and that's how I treat my IEMs when I need to, clean them, clean the ear tips, take the ear tips off, clean the nozzles, stuff like that. Where One Nation saying, I think the Helios is a good alternative to the IER M9. And yeah, I would probably, again, the M9 is another earphone that I have not spent a lot of time listening to. Just based on sound quality, I would probably pick the Helios. I like the sound of the Helios better. In terms of ergonomics, I don't know. I don't know about that one. Planet Jace, I think you're gonna have to upgrade your trolling in order to get past the filter that I've developed. That feels now like they've challenged you. In which case I'm gonna have to. You're gonna like come in with another alt username or something like that. Chris Stroud saying Slow Dive. That is an artist that I have an album by. Scott Pledger, good to see you. You are late, but you know what? I don't mind. Glad you can make it. Hope you're having a good Sunday evening. Oh, and Scott, to catch you up on the rating on the Symphonium, I went with 3 stars. I was on the verge, could have given it 4 stars, but the sound quality is technically excellent. The tonal balance a little bit thin for my taste, but generally I like it. For me though, the biggest detractor is more the form factor stuff, and a lot of it is petty like aesthetics. Which is that real? I think it's real. It's real for me, damn it. Oh, and Scott, you're saying ergonomics is a prerequisite for sound for me. If it's not comfortable, I'm just not going to use it. Yeah, I'm with you. And it's also the sort of thing where like form factor and ergonomics and sound quality are not actually quite equals, in the sense that like form factor and ergonomics, there's like a level of sufficiency past which it's just gravy, right? The Moondrop S8, this is a beautiful IEM and it fits me phenomenally, but there are a lot of IEMs that don't look this nice, that don't fit quite as nice as this, that I think are sufficiently ergonomic. And I think once you cross that line of sufficiency, then it becomes all about the sound. Unless it looks really good, which some of them do. And the S8, frankly, is one of them. Non-min, you're late again. That's okay. I was going to say there's a rewind button, but I don't know that YouTube actually has a rewind button. You just have to scrub, which is kind of a pain in the butt, but it's there. Carlos asking if I could have just one of them, which would it be? The Mangard T or the FiO FH7? Well, I haven't heard the FH7, and the Mangard T, I think it's solid in IEM, but I didn't love it. So I'm going to say I don't like the choice. Oh yeah, Scott, about SoCal Can Jam. I was considering going to it, but I don't know. I got too many things kind of up in the air at home that I didn't feel great about taking the weekend off for it. Omar asking, would I take the Helios over the Andromeda? I think versus like the 2020 Andromeda, which is the latest revision of it, I would probably take the Andromeda personally over the Helios. Now, they're very different tonal balances. The Andromeda, I would say, squarely falls into a warm tonality. But yeah, I think I would personally pick the Andromeda 2020. And they are priced pretty similar. Oh, Chick, glad to hear the Roadie wrap is working out well for your Aria cable. But like I mentioned, I think we're gonna have to go ahead and cut this Q&A off at this point. I gotta cook dinner, grocery shop, and play some Castlevania Symphony of the Night. So thank you all for tuning in to the live chat and the review. Really do appreciate all the questions and hanging around to have a conversation. But if you want to continue the conversation, I do have a link to my Discord server in the description down below. And while you're down there, please do hit the like button for the video if you haven't already. It does help me out. Subscribe to the channel, ding the bell, and I'll catch you on the next Super Review. Have a good week, folks.